are voices that make people uncomfortable, not because they are loud, but because they come from somewhere nobody expected. A voice belonging to a young woman, without a title, without a position, without any army behind her, telling popes and kings exactly what they needed to hear and did not want to listen to. That was Catherine of Siena. Not a stained glass figure, not a decorative saint. A flesh and blood woman, born in a 14th century Italian city, who left a mark on the history of the Church that is still, today, difficult to explain without stopping to think about what kind of person she actually was. Caterina Benincasa was born in Siena in 1347. Her father, Giacomo, was a cloth dyer. Her family was large, full of children, of everyday noise, of manual work and ordinary life. Nothing in that background gave any visible sign of what was coming. Siena was then an important city in Tuscany, shaped by internal political tensions, rivalries, and an intense urban life. And the world surrounding that family was a world in deep crisis. The Black Death had devastated Europe years earlier. The Italian city-states lived in constant conflict, and the Church was going through one of the most delicate moments of its medieval history. The papacy had been based in Avignon, in southern France, for decades, far from Rome, under a political influence that many people inside and outside the Church considered unacceptable. Catherine grew up in that environment. From a young age, she showed a strong spiritual inclination, an inner seriousness that drew attention. She was not an easygoing child or a teenager who could be talked into things. She had a strong character. Her family tried to guide her life toward marriage, as was expected of a young woman of her time and background. She resisted, not dramatically, but with a firmness that left the people around her unsettled. Her orientation was toward God, toward prayer, toward a life that did not fit the usual patterns. She became affiliated with the Mantelate, laywomen associated with Dominican spirituality. This is important for understanding what her life actually was. Catherine was not a cloistered nun. She did not shut herself away in a convent or disappear from the world. She was a laywoman who chose to live an intense spiritual life in the middle of the city, in direct contact with the sick, with the poor, with the real conflicts of her time. That position gave her a freedom of movement and action that a life inside a convent would not have offered her in the same way. And it was precisely that freedom that ended up shaping her mission. Her prayer life was demanding. She is said to have spent long hours in contemplation, her relationship with God intimate and constant, her interior life generating an energy that those who knew her perceived as something different. There is no need to exaggerate that aspect for it to be significant. What matters is that her spirituality was not an escape from the world. It was, on the contrary, the engine of her engagement with it. The deeper her interior life became, the stronger her impulse outward. That impulse first showed itself in the streets of Siena. Catherine cared for the sick in hospitals, accompanied those living on the margins, showed up in situations most people preferred to ignore. Not as an abstract act of charity, but as a concrete expression of a faith that understood love for God could not be separated from love for real people. That service was not the minor part of her spiritual life. It was its most direct expression. But Catherine did not stay in Siena, not geographically and not in terms of how far her voice reached. She started writing letters, many letters, to ordinary people seeking spiritual guidance, to clergy who needed an honest mirror held up to them, to rulers making decisions that affected thousands of people, to cardinals settled comfortably into a power that had lost its direction, to kings who needed someone to tell them the truth without softening it. She wrote with an authority that came from no official position. It came from something harder to explain and harder to ignore. It came from a coherent life, from a conviction that was not trying to please anyone, from a clarity about what was right and what was not. Her letters were not gentle. They were not diplomatic in the sense of saying what the recipient wanted to hear. They were direct, sometimes sharp, always carrying a charity that did not exclude firmness. Catherine could exhort, console, correct, and challenge within the same letter. She could write to a cardinal reminding him of his responsibilities with a frankness that would have seemed scandalous if it had not been accompanied by an evident spiritual depth. There was something in her words that made it impossible for whoever received them to simply set them aside. The situation of the Church at that time called for exactly that kind of voice. The papacy had been in Avignon since 1309. For decades, popes had resided in that city in southern France, under the political influence of the French crown, something many people experienced as a distortion of the Church's mission. Rome, the historic seat of the Bishop of Rome, the seat of Peter, stood empty of that presence. For many faithful and for many theologians and reformers, this was an open wound. The Church needed to return to Rome. It needed to recover an independence that had been slowly dissolved through decades of political comfort. Catherine said so. She wrote it. She repeated it. And she did not say it as a political slogan, but as a spiritual conviction. For her, the Pope was the vicar of Christ, and that responsibility demanded courage, not security. It demanded being in Rome, in the place that was his, even if that meant facing difficulty. Gregory XI received her letters. He took them seriously. In 1376, Catherine traveled to Avignon to speak with him directly. That encounter between a young laywoman from Siena and the visible head of the Catholic Church is one of the strangest and most revealing moments of the entire medieval period. There was no structural reason for Gregory XI to listen to Catherine. She held no office. She commanded no army. She represented no political power. She had a conviction and a consistency of life that gave her words real weight. Gregory XI returned to Rome in 1377. It was not because of Catherine alone, and it would be too simple to present it that way. There were political pressures, negotiations, complex historical circumstances. But Catherine's insistence was a real part of that process. Her voice mattered at a moment when the voice of a young woman had no guaranteed institutional space to be heard. The final years of her life were not years of triumph. When Gregory XI died in 1378, the Western Schism tore open a new wound. Two men claimed to be the legitimate pope, one in Rome and one in Avignon, and the Church found itself divided by a crisis that would not be resolved for decades. Catherine supported Urban VI, the Pope of Rome, and worked for unity with the same energy she had poured into the return of the papacy. But she was a woman running out of strength. She had given everything she had. She died in Rome in 1380, at 33 years old, the same age as the one who had been the center of her entire life. Before she died, she had dictated her most extensive spiritual work, the dialogue, an imagined conversation between the soul and God that gathers her theological thinking and her mystical experience into a single text. It is still read today, not as a historical document, but as a living voice. She was canonized in 1461. In 1970, Paul VI declared her a Doctor of the Church, one of the highest honors the Church can grant in recognition of the depth and universality of a spiritual teaching. In 1999, John Paul II named her a patron of Europe, alongside Benedict of Nursia and Bridget of Sweden, acknowledging that her life and thought are part of the spiritual foundation of the continent. There is something about Catherine's story that does not fit neatly into any comfortable category. She was not a martyr. She was not the founder of a religious order. She was not a queen or an abbess. She was a young laywoman from a craftsman's family who decided to take her faith seriously and discovered, through that seriousness, that she had something to say, and that the responsibility of saying it was part of her calling. That tension between her powerless origins and the real force of her word is what keeps her life an active question for anyone who takes seriously the relationship between faith and the world. Staying silent can also be a way of abandoning your mission. That is what Catherine's life shows, more clearly than any abstract argument could. She did not speak because she wanted attention. She spoke because she understood that loving the church did not mean looking the other way when the church needed to hear something hard. She did not speak because she had power. She spoke because she had a life that backed up her words, and that coherence was the only authority she needed. A young woman from Siena, the daughter of a cloth dyer, with no throne, no office, no army, whose voice reached Avignon and Rome and which still, centuries later, arrives with the same clarity for anyone willing to listen.